Hey, here we go. This is Diminishing Responsibility. Steve here, and joining me is my former employer, William Faith. So, because of that fact, I've got to put him through the ringer. So, how you doing, William?
All right, how you doing, man?
I'm great. We're living in some strange times at the moment.
It's an understatement.
Yeah. How are you navigating yourself through the world at the moment? What's jumping out at you?
That is a loaded topic if there ever was one.
Are you holding your sanity? Is the sanity slipping?
No, I think sanity runs out when you're short on things to do, and I've never had that luxury.
Right. There you go.
But no, for the most part, just pressing on with a lot of the same things that I've been waffling on about for years. The permaculture stuff is kind of my coping mechanism more than anything else, and and doing that work. And at the same time, watching the just sort of reactionary, tennis match on social media and all the rest of it. I confess to having mucked in with some of that a bit myself, but a lot of the rhetoric is disturbing and, in my opinion, a bit short-sighted. And I think people are adopting polarities and running to extremes. And there's a lot of name-calling and shouting people down in place of dialogue, which is the most disturbing part of all of it.
So, I mean, the two things you mentioned there are linked. So let's start with one. Let's start with permaculture, because permaculture is something that you actually introduced me to. When you and me started working together, eight or so years ago, when you were working on the first Christ versus War album that you produced, and me and Marcia were playing in Faith in the Muse. So we spent an awful lot of time with you, awful lot of time at your house, and that's when I discovered that gardening can be political. How would you describe it if you were going to just give someone a quick blast who'd never heard of it before? And to you, what does it mean?
The quick version that I usually throw out there is when people ask what permaculture is just designing sustainable human systems, and that's usually a intellectually unsatisfying answer. So that usually leads off to a series of questions and hopefully a conversation. And
right.
That's when we kind of get into that it's a design system more than anything else. And it's using a series of thinking tools to try to design things that can be continued into the indefinite future, that are not extractive, that are regenerative, and that are fulfilling. And so with that, there's the ethics, the three ethics that hold permaculture together, which is earth care of the earth and all of its living and non-living systems; people care, which is care of one another; and fair share, which is also described as setting limits to consumption and population, and then return the surplus into the first two. So those ethics are really what separates permaculture from things like landscape architecture. A lot of people will kind of brush it off by saying that, oh yeah, it's organic gardening. It's a common misnomer, but there's so much more to it than that. And in design, it's equal parts art and science. So there's a lot of creativity that goes into it. If you gave two permaculturists the same social system or the same landscape to design, you would likely never get the same two designs back. They would always be very different, because you can use the same set of data, but once your creativity comes into it, it's something, people will take it in one direction or another. People will notice different things and act on different things. So that's the part that I think is most engaging to me.
So it's kind of got its own basis ideology on, like you said, not purging the land, not purging people's time. It's supposed to be something that accumulates all of those things to further better living, which is a strange thing at the moment in this time where we live in kind of a relatively liberal Western capitalist democracy. That kind of thing comes across almost like a privileged position, no doubt, to some people, because this is something that people don't realize is vastly important. It's something that we have lost touch with. And so this was a natural thing for thousands of years and how people lived. And we've become that disconnected from it. But there's a dark side to it, because there's a feeling amongst many people, from what I understand in those circles, that's being perpetuated more, that we may be crashing back into that world head first. So and that comes from many different points of view. That comes from just political and all that, and it comes from the peak oil thing and that as well. So do you think that there's a certain kind of doomsday prep edge to permaculture?
Well, there's a couple of interesting things about that. Firstly, to back up just a titch, to the idea that it's very privileged, or that we're drawing from old traditions. That's absolutely true, in the respect that, yeah, there is nothing essentially new about permaculture. Mollison and Holmgren themselves, the two Aussies that created the concept, or more accurately assembled the concept, they always said that we're on the cutting edge of a 10,000-year-old technology. That, you know, it's a bunch of really old traditions and concepts that are collected, you know, in terms of strategy and technique, but it's the design thinking component that makes it unique and makes it what it is.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Culture is not really how to do something; it's how to think about doing something, and that's what makes it different for everybody. And so people will see, you know, sheet mulching, or they'll see, you know, guilds like the Three Sisters Guild, which is a Native American guild, and different little techniques and things that are used, but the techniques are not the end. The techniques are only applicable in specific circumstances. It's going to be different everywhere. You'd never get the same sort of design in an arid landscape as you would in a cold climate. You know, these things are always going to change, and the strategies dictate what techniques are used. But jumping ahead to the sort of situation that we're in, yes, there's a lot of talk in permaculture circles about that ultimately a lot of these skills that we're developing and working on and trying to share with other people are ultimately going to be in great need, in, you know, depending on where you're at on the timeline, you know, sooner or later. But
sorry to interrupt you, but kind of that kind of goes back to the slight what I kind of meant by privilege maybe is that I'm sure most people out there don't even have access or close to access to what they think land is to do that on. It's not, and that's not even because necessarily they can't do that. Most people would be able to figure it out if they could, but people are that disconnected from getting out of the box, and that kind of has a rolling stone effect of the more people are disconnected, the bigger the problem gets, and it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense. I'm sorry to cut you off, but
No, I'm with you on that. Ironically, a lot of the people that don't have access to it, a lot of the people who are in the undeveloped world, in a lot of cases are already living in relative balance with their environment. They already, you know, a lot of, you know, tribal and forest peoples already know how to live within the of the environment. But it's a lot of the Western designs that for living that have created a lot of this mess. And so as a result, we're trying to circle back and try to, you know, get the best parts out of the past combined with the sort of, you know, technological advancement that we have at the moment, and try to apply that in a way that we can navigate energy descent and climate change as elegantly as we can, to try to, you know, soften the impacts that are absolutely, I mean, for certain on the horizon. It's just really a matter of when and what we do and how we do it. And so the prepper portion of the program, which you referenced, is absolutely a thing. We deal with that in permaculture a lot. We'll get people that will come in and take great interest in, you know, biodynamic gardening and food forestry and rainwater catchment and composting and all these things, and think they're absolutely fantastic. But then when it comes to the sort of people care component, they've got, you know, gun nests on turrets and claymore mines planted on their front lawn kind of approach. You know, so it's a fair bit different in application, and that's where we kind of differ. So we try to we have long discussions with the people who come in with the prepper mindset to kind of try to point out that the world that they're actually designing is not one that they'd actually want to live in.
It's often the case.
And that in times of crisis, actually, your best hedge is community, is knowing your neighbors and having a connection to the place that you're in. There's
that doesn't
the ability
sound very
to
libertarian to me. That doesn't sound very libertarian to me.
Well, exactly.
I love the kind of meme of the libertarian, which is some guy on his ranch with a fence around it, with a stack of bartering gold and some guns and a cigar and some sipping whiskey, sitting it out. It's strange. It's like when people pit themselves one up against someone else. It probably wouldn't take an awful lot to take that from someone if they really want to go to Mad Max Bartertown.
That's it. Just getting back to that might makes right kind of principle, which is kind of scary.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, libertarians, I've heard them pretty accurately described as Republicans with bombs.
Right.
For the most part. So yeah, when it comes down to it, I mean, we are a tribal species. We need community. We need each other. And it makes a lot more sense to invest in that than it does to try to create this, all these provisions. I've got canned food to last me the next 12 years, and videotapes of Sanford and Son. There's a little bit more to life than that, and I think it's a bit short-sighted and myopic on their part.
So you would obviously see a couple of those people enter into the fold, and there is obviously a collectivist kind of like left kind of leaning to it as well, like removing a monetary system out of it. Now, it depends if we're just talking about pushing it past mere resources into an actual living scenario. So there's a certain collectivist thing, but what I always liked, the thing that always stuck with me with the permaculture thing was the what was it? Think globally but act locally.
Well, yeah, that's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
And in terms of the government, the sort of social systems portion of it, how permaculture has attempted to navigate that is to really create a sort of a pluralist situation where, it's not trying to replace systems, it's trying to create complementary systems that exist alongside the existing framework. So in a time of collapse, if something does go down, you do have redundant systems to fall back on. That's really kind of a little bit more where we're at with it.
Yeah.
So in the transition towns movement, which was created by a permaculture teacher from Totnes, named Rob Hopkins, he there's been a lot of penetration into the UK in particular with it, and in Brixton, the transition towns Brixton have created the Brixton Pound, which exists alongside Sterling.
Right.
And is accepted by a great number of shops. They have a pay by text version of the currency.
Sounds like Brixton needs some freedom.
Huh?
Sounds like Brixton needs some freedom.
Well, I mean, it's amazing that the mayor, the local mayor, actually takes a percentage of his annual salary in it. So
it's not like a cryptocurrency thing. It's an actual physical.
It is. They actually have Bowie on their 10-pound note. He's from Brixton. Yeah, so you actually have that going for you. I'll take that over dead presidents any day of the week.
Yeah. But I loved the transition towns movement. The simple act of, if you're going to plant trees, maybe plant walnut trees. like something that simple. We're not talking about knocking everything down and rebuilding it. It's just, if you're going to do something, maybe think how that will regenerate itself back into the local community.
It's the old permaculture thing of redundancies, multiple uses, multiple functions. So if you're going to plant a tree, that's great. Let's do something that beautifies the community, that adds shade to, and whatnot, but also maybe produces food, that we can get an additional yield out of it. So it's just tweaking the existing framework to get a little bit more out of it.
I mean, in its more subtle form, it's not even necessarily about food. It's about creating a local community where people can actually come and interact with each other again. Absolutely. Because people are so disconnected. And that was the big thing that Richard Heinberg would go on in the parties over and stuff about Suburbia. I mean, there was that. There was the End of Suburbia, the documentary, The End of Suburbia. Sorry, about how disconnected suburban towns are in America and how basically it would probably take an hour's walk to get to the supermarket, let alone anything else. It's the strangest thing. But on the flip side of that, I have kind of a fond memory of being in the tour bus with you, driving through Eastern Europe, through the Czech Republic, through Poland, and as we're driving through all these villages and stuff, everyone is growing food. There's bean poles, there's everything. There's also still a bunch of old bomb shelters back there, but which kind of had a kind of a dark, sinister kind of edge to everything. But everyone is still very connected with the land, but on a point where they wouldn't even really recognize it as the fact. It's just, I have a yard and I kind of like food, so
we've said forever in a day that the ultimate goal of permaculture is to be invisible. That it doesn't even necessarily operate under that name anymore. It's just the way we do things.
Yes. So what kind of age gap, what kind of age group is being attracted to this? You seeing a lot of young kids coming in, or is...
I've been teaching about 2 full courses a year currently. And I'm fortunate enough to say that it's been actually really, really varied in terms of age, gender, race. It's been really wide and kind of all over the map. I'll say that the predominant demographic is college age,
right?
For the most part. But it's always very heartening to me when we got people that are entering. For you're just kind of there to see what they can learn, and then usually emerge pretty charged up and ready to do stuff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it kind of makes sense, because if my mom was to turn up, she's been growing her own vegetables for 50 years. She'd probably be like, "Oh, you actually gather this together and teach this? This is what I do."
Because when you get a diverse group of students, everyone's bringing something to the table. So you always kind of go to the sort of wisdom of the group and start tweaking that out. It's always, what you learn is always more than what was taught, and that's kind of what we hope for.
I don't think people, okay, getting back to the food thing, I don't think people even, the amount of people who have never even tasted a vegetable that came off the vine, or potato, like eating a sweet corn that has just been pulled, and like eating it within 5 minutes. I'm sure if everyone actually got to experience what that's like, it would catch on very quickly.
You've actually had a fresh tomato off the vine.
It's insane.
The one that's traveled 1,500 miles and been bred for thick skin so that it travels and keeps well. It's a very different experience.
I heard a thing recently. Some guy thought he too on YouTube did a thing about apples. He said that most apples that you eat in the supermarket are a year old. Like they've been flash frozen and then waxed up and just stored. So it's a different world. So
it's a completely different set of drivers. I mean, we eat such a almost monocultured version of these things. We eat 2 varieties of potatoes actively. There's two prominent varieties of corn that we use. And potatoes, there. I mean, hundreds of varieties, but we've focused on these that we can produce and maintain a fairly stable and consistent product at the end of the day. So it's a sad fact of the way the system currently operates. But when you're actually growing in your own garden, in your own climate, it's a completely different game. You're free to experiment and try different things. It changes what you eat.
So you went from living in the desert in outside of Los Angeles to living into, I take it, quite metropolitan Chicago right now.
Pretty much so, yeah.
So how does one approach permaculture, going from a desert to a frozen metropolis?
It's one of those things that I really, really relished the challenge when I got here, because I didn't know what to expect. I'd always had, relatively recent arrival in permaculture. I took my PhD in 2006, and so started experimenting wildly. And you were there for
I felt like an experiment. I was shitting in a bucket. every weekend.
Indeed you were.
Indeed I was. But unfortunately, I was also drinking my own body weight in Guinness, so I don't think it was a pleasant experience for anyone involved.
The yeast inputs alone made for a very certain lifestyle. But we thank you for your input. But
you're welcome. I've grown some Irish potatoes out in the garden now. So.
But so yeah, that was early days. We were experimenting a lot, and trying different things, and then coming out here and working in a hyper urban landscape. It's a very different situation. And when I first kind of came and plugged in with the community, I was wondering how that was going to play out. And I went to my first meetup here maybe 6 months after I got here, and on the train to go meet everybody at the restaurant, the first thing that all of a sudden just jumped out at me when I was looking out the window of the train is all these flat rooftops as far as the eye could see. And it just clicked all of a sudden. It's like, these are water collectors, these are energy collectors, these are potential rooftop gardens. There's so many limitless, virtually limitless opportunities in the vertical space. So I started kind of working on that. I live on the third floor of an apartment building, and so we happen to be fortunate enough to have access to the second floor deck, which is rooftop. Right. And out there I've done straw bale gardening. So I'm growing a considerable amount of produce in a 9-bale system.
Is there any bureaucratic backlash to people doing this? I mean, there's, is this something you have to keep under your hat? There's obviously in Oregon, you can be arrested for collecting rainwater, So how is this something? Is there a precedent of people doing this in Chicago before you? Have you connected with anyone else?
Yep, there are rooftop gardens here, and I did a lot of research on it before starting. But the limits that you just run into are primarily code and structural, as far as what the rooftops will actually hold in weight. And so you have to. It's for the most part you work with container gardening if you're doing rooftops here for the most part, unless you have a full-on, concrete and beam reinforced roof that can take a certain amount of weight for you to actually do a soil-based medium. But within the limitations of what I have here, we started using straw bales. And so you literally take organic straw bales and treat them with a certain amount of nitrogen, which some of us are fortunate enough to produce in our own little oven, if you follow my meaning. And then add a little bit of phosphate, or potassium, usually in the form of wood ash, and a little bit of comfrey tea, and that seasons the bales and prepares them for use. So you can plant directly into them. The bale turns into the container, essentially.
Oh, wow.
And you plant right into them. And then at the end of 2 years, once you've exhausted them in 2 cycles, it just turns into compost. Right. So it's a pretty great system. I've been experimenting with it and had pretty great yields so far.
Nice.
So that's what food growing in third floor apartment looks like here.
That's almost like the purest form of anarchism right there. Just like just taking it into your own hands. No authority but yourself. Right there. Just like, but so
fun about all of that is that the thing I've been trying to do, part of sort of your reason for being within the permaculture framework, is to de-hippify the whole permaculture thing, and so there have been a few others that have kind of been along that line. My mate Graham Burnett, he comes from the whole.
I still have your permaculture book that he wrote.
Yep.
Probably have that back at some point.
Right, but he grew up in that whole era, and still teaches courses at Dial House to this day.
Which is somewhere you went at one point, right?
Absolutely, made the pilgrimage, as it were. But and then after that, a lot of the thing that struck me is early on reading a lot of Mollison and Holmgren, the guys who created the permaculture thing. A lot of it read kind of like dual power anarchism to me. A lot of the language was very familiar.
Yes.
And when I read the Transition Towns book, it also read very familiar. So when Rob Hopkins came over on a tour of the U.S. A few years back, and so the first thing I said to him when I walked up to him, just based on what I've read of his work, I said, at any point did you come into contact with the anarcho-punk milieu in your adolescent years? He goes, well, I did stop eating meat at the age of 14 because of a flux of pink Indians. Anyways, my favorite band in the world is The Fall. So I was like, okay, there you go.
I would have given up on permaculture right there. Marky Smith can't do Marky Smith. So, sorry, I know there's an army of 4 fans out there, but
Some people can't. Fair enough.
it's fingers down a chalkboard for me. But yeah, so that's kind of a rough transition to let's get to more pressing topics of the day. I guess there's as far as anarchism goes and what we've seen growing up between you and me. We've both kind of floated around on the edges of that and directly been involved now and then. You know, I played in old punk bands. You played with Conflict. You had Anima Monday, which, you know, very, very, very political punk band. Faith in the Muse obviously had, amongst many other things, you know, that message, especially in the later years, flowing through it. Also, how do you see the kind of anarcho thing as being approached by people these days? Because in the last 12 months, it's really got a bit confusing.
Yeah, that's the polite word for it. It's been really rough. I just recently took a bunch of heat for a post I made on Facebook, kind of trying to dissect the Charlottesville and Berkeley thing, and I've never made any bones about the fact that I do consider myself an anarchist. I always have done. Mm-hmm. But in this moment, I did say that I kind of find myself out of step with a lot of the sort of post 9/11 actions carried out in the name of anarchism, and the same with certain strategies and tactics employed by Antifa. The events of Charlottesville and more directly Berkeley are kind of pointing towards something that I don't really share an affinity or rather any connection to. Mm-hmm. In terms of I don't doubt that a lot of us want the same thing, that a lot of us have the same end desires, but our roadmap for getting there differs drastically. I don't think that in terms of strategies and tactics that these are the most effective of approaching this. I don't see it. We've entered an era where dialogue is just absent. It's just shouting each other down. And with a lot of the identity politics and political correctness that's in the air, a good friend of mine here has described that fairly accurately, in my opinion, as shut up dialogue.
Right, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
It's basically just saying that it's throwing a term at you that somehow invalidates your opinion, and he kind of twists a little bit to say it's like, well, you know, your facts make me feel bad, so stop with your facts, yes. Kind of thing. It's and it's not productive. It doesn't advance anything, and it just puts everybody at a standstill. And the end results are rather ghastly. I feel that the fronts that we have way more in common with the apparent polarities than is immediately obvious. And I know that the people at the top relish this kind of discourse because it keeps us from creating any real problem for
Absolutely. Them. Yeah. I have many opinions on the subject. I usually have many opinions on pretty much anything. But the strangest thing that I've encountered is just purely stating adding violence into political discourse is a slippery slope that is very, very difficult to escape from. And I naturally get like an equivalency fallacy thrown at me, like, we're talking about Nazis here. And it's like, I never said adding violence, any particular person adding violence in is a slippery slope. Violence itself is a very slippery slope that is very, very hard to pull back from. It's obvious that there are quite a strong element on the right that want confrontation. we're talking. There's a lot. There's a lot of people out there who have been gearing up for confrontation their whole life. You know, there's people. You know, how many years have you heard people saying that America's going to there's going to be a race war one day, and you've heard this from the Ku Klux Klan and all these people, and for so long it's just been like, yeah, whatever. Get back to whatever decade your thought processes come from, and then suddenly within 18 months it's like, oh shit, this might actually be a reality. But it's weird, just advocating against violence, political violence, has lumbered me in a very, very bad position with a lot of people. And it's baffling. I don't understand. I mean, we've been talking regarding the permaculture stuff and all that, possibly about as positive a side of anarchism and I don't want to say liberal thinking, but it's a respect of the individual, which I think anarchism to me has always been about the individual. I didn't get into punk rock and goth rock and all that stuff because I wanted to be necessarily part of a collective. It was something that was important for me. And now I'm seeing a lot of people who desperately want to segregate. And segregation is just insanity. There's just nothing's good. Nothing's good about it. It's about taking away people's ability to think for themselves. Sorry, that wasn't very concise, but that's the identity politics thing. It's insane. And I've talking to some of these people, and they literally can't see out of the identity politics lens. It's like blinkers on them. So
it's because it's mentally, I mean, intellectually, it's lazy, and
it's incredibly lazy.
It's an easy answer, and it allows you to exist in this binary. Mm-hmm. Black and white, right and wrong, no shades of gray. It's another
no
friend of mine.
No shades of gray? That's racist.
Right, and the whole it's a return to the Bush rhetoric. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists or or the Nazis, as it were. And so there's just no nuance and subtlety, and any sort of shade of gray has gone out the window. It doesn't exist anymore. We exist in memes and slogans. And I had one guy commenting on my post saying, "Well, that sounds like a bunch of privileged bourgeois nonsense to me. How many anti-fascist posts have you made lately?" As if that's the gold standard. It's like, oh, I haven't posted any anti-fascist memes. Maybe I'm actually nursing some fascistic sentiment in
So he basically turned around without realizing and said, "How much virtue signaling have you done to your friends recently?" Right.
And said, my work is my statement.
Yeah, absolutely.
White supremacy, and if you don't know what that is, you haven't been paying attention. So it's post shitty memes all day long, but what are you doing? And so that's it's again. I think it's a comfortable space for a lot of people to exist in, because you have that echo chamber of everybody else saying we're right, without even realizing that there's this other polarity that's doing the exact same thing.
Absolutely.
But I think the biggest point that exists in there that most people lose is another person had mentioned these arguments of convenience that we take, where someone who may not even be a Trump voter, but someone who even brings up, some sort of conflict or an issue with your argument, immediately gets couched as a Nazi. They're immediately just stuffed over to the right. And in so doing, you kind of gift them to the other side, because now they've got nowhere to go. And there's this other group of people waiting for them with open arms that aren't judging them for their opinion.
Yes.
As readily. And so it's like, oh, yeah, they called you a Nazi too. Oh, well, yeah, come on in with us. And, it's a number of people who may not even be, anywhere near that end of it, maybe closer to our end of the spectrum. But because they're not politically pure, because they're not towing the party line and saying all the right words, and don't know all the identity politics, they get cast over, into the Nazi side. And so they get, shunted off into that category. And all you do is ensure larger numbers on that end and ensure polarities.
Yeah.
until we start listening to people, until we start having actual conversation and discussion and civil debate, we're going to be in this mess, and it's going to get worse rather than better.
It kind of scared me. Just yesterday, I was having a Facebook discussion with someone regarding Antifa and regarding the battle for Berkeley, and I remember seeing it quite. It blew up at the time. Got a lot of media coverage, and since then, there's been an awful lot of the footage that's come out of people on the ground just with their phone footage and stuff. So, this young lady, remain nameless, obviously, was stating that was Antifa versus white supremacist Nazis, and I was like, no one likes a Nazi. That's fair, but I've seen a lot of this footage, and a lot of the people on the conservative side, they certainly weren't white supremacists. I think they were immediately cancelled out of that group by the fact that they weren't actually white. So, there was quite an ethnic diverse, like contingent on that side, and
you don't want facts get in the way of a good rant.
Well, no, she flat out denied that was the case, and she said, "Prove it." So I did, with footage of many people, and she immediately started saying, "Oh, they're just students that got caught up, and they're this, and they're just that. That's just the local people." I was like, "Well, that's kind of racist for you to deny the agency of someone because their ethnicity doesn't fit in with your narrative." That's a dangerous precedent, because what she was essentially doing was dehumanizing people as a certain category, regardless of actually their individual characteristics. And I'm not saying creed or color or sexuality. These people had gathered together because they share a certain ideology or antithesis of ideology. And to paint everyone there as a white supremacist was tricky. Now, I don't in any way, shape, or form agree with actually anyone involved whatsoever, to be honest. But it was just strange to just see someone basically accidentally be racist, calling people white supremacists. It was rather bizarre, but I mean, we've been playing in punk rock bands all our lives, been to punk rock shows all our lives. That neo-Nazi contingent has always been there, and some of these people are incredibly scary. The first show I ever played over here was at the Galaxy Theatre in Huntington Beach. First time in America. First show I ever played when I was playing with KSUK. And I would say 50, 60 Nazi lowrider skinheads, all surfer jocks, all skinheads, huge, swastika tattoos like out of American History X. All ages show, beat the living shit out of every kid there that would even get close to the dance floor. They owned the place. The only reason they were allowed in is because the security was scared of them. I'm kind of surprised that I haven't seen these people show up yet. I've seen a lot of redneck Trump supporters. I've seen a couple of dorks with swastika flags and stuff, but I haven't seen the real hardcore mean side of what has always existed. And that kind of concerns me, because Antifa, from what I can tell, pull a lot of people in from universities, from the punk scene and stuff. A lot of these people are my friends.
Right.
I'm actually kind of concerned, because if this shit really does hit the fan, I don't think the real Nazis have come out to play yet.
That's the thing, is Chris Hodges did an article on this that I thought was really astute, and he's been tarred and feathered for it, as well as some of the things that Chomsky has said. But the fact of it is, these guys really know something about doling out violence,
Oh,
and
yes. Mhm.
and they know how to do it. I mean, it's what they do. And no, we haven't seen those guys come out to play. And
Well,
coming up,
in England, the National Front and soccer hooligans can be interchangeable because it's just fighting. It's like staring into the eyes of a shark. It's a proper Nazi skinhead is the problem. It's a scary human being.
it is. Growing up in Los Angeles in the '80s, I mean, the South Bay skins were a very real thing. And if you went to Fenders, for a gig back in the day, you were taking your life into your own hands. I mean, it was the thing. Yeah, I remember. God, it was Bad Brains, Adolescence, Final Conflict, and I'd walked into that gig, and my hair had grown a little long at that point. And then it was only once we got there that we found out that Agnostic Front was supposed to play, but canceled last minute.
Oops.
So the gig was, I would have thought Bad Brains, yeah, probably not so much, but no, the place was fucking packed with them. And I wasn't in the venue 2 minutes watching Final Conflict before a group of South Bay skins was centered with this one guy named Moose, who was aptly named and was at least 3 inches taller than me.
Right, and you're not a small unit yourself. How tall are you? 6'2"?
No, this was probably 1985 or 86, I want to say. So yeah, 16, 17-ish, something like that.
Okay.
Maybe 18. And walked up to me and just said, tapped me on the shoulders. I hate long hairs. And I was just all like, not here to bother anybody, man. Just watching the show. Walked across the venue. Then watched him talk to his friends. They all came over, made a half circle around me, and marched me right out the door. If I'd stopped at any point, I would have been done. It was, and these guys, the body count was high. I went with about 6 friends. One of them made it to the end of the show.
Right.
Each one of them were progressively dealt with by the skins at some point. Thrown out. So, I mean, they used to run entire venues back in the day, and it wasn't pretty. People got thrashed. People got hurt. That's what they thrive on.
Moa, the singer of KSUK, the second singer of KSUK, who I toured with when I was in the band. His all-time favorite band was Crass, and he used to go see Crass quite a lot when he was a kid. He said they were the worst shows for that stuff because they were there not because their favorite band was playing. They were there because that's where the fighting's going to be. Yeah, the absolute. Yeah, but it's weird though. But at the same time, there's a guy I know called Buddy T, who's a big black dude who's into funk, and he said the most violent show he ever went to was Talk supporting the Sisters of Mercy. So maybe there's no actual raw method to the madness.
The one night that Japan opened for the Damned was pretty close.
Oh, that's awesome.
I had to walk the stage after 2 songs, I'm told.
No, it's scary. I'm genuinely worried, especially. It's weird. I feel like there's a divide and conquer thing that people aren't picking up on. The one theme that I've seen that's been running through all the incidents that have happened is the lack of police interaction. And coming from a punk rocker, like wanting police interaction sounds weird, but when you've got essentially an ideological race war happening in Oakland, Charlottesville, anywhere like that, and literally the police are on the perimeter, journalists are going up to them asking why are they not getting involved, and the police are like, just been told to stand down. It's like when people are literally attacking each other with all kinds of weaponry. Now it's got to the point where the body count has started from Charlottesville. There was the Antifa guy in Berkeley who hit someone over the head with a bike lock and now looks like he's possibly facing 40 years in jail. Whether that's true or not. You have to question why the police have been taking a sidestep to this, especially over the last couple of years. There's been an awful lot of talk about how violent the police are. That's how the Black Lives Matter movement came around, and all of a sudden, these thugs in uniform in the perfect opportunity are not getting involved. Something bizarre is going on. So there's a divide and conquer thing going on, and obviously in the last week or so, it was announced that the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have considered Antifa to be a domestic terrorist group, and have actually admitted that they've been keeping tabs on a lot of these people for the last 10, 12 months. So, without going to Alex Jones, what do you feel about that? Do you think that there's a larger plan, a divide and conquer thing, or
Bannon has pretty much said as much in the most sort of actually plain way. When he was interviewed, he says, I want to keep the left talking about racism all day long. He says, I want them to talk about it every day.
Right.
It's because that way we can actually get our, economic nationalism, in place. So it is that simple divide and conquer thing. It's an easy and old trick, and I feel like everyone is falling for it. And it's basic shock doctrine. It's, you have this sort of this moment that occurs, and the fallout after it. So much is spent dissecting it and arguing, and totally not noticing everything that's going on in its wake, the things that are being pushed through. And in terms of this, divide and conquer is the nature of the game. It's astounding to me how readily everyone falls for this, how everyone accepts it as the done thing without questioning it at all, and runs to these extremes and polarities without even giving it a second thought. That we actually have far more in common with one another than we do with these people at the top, which, as I've said before, I mean, they don't give a shit about anything but our production capacity.
Yeah, they really don't. And as we have less and less production capacity, they just don't give a shit about us at all. So, and it's not like this isn't already been happening. I won't go into the 9/11 thing or anything, but one thing we can all agree on is that after 9/11 happened, we all have to take our shoes off at the airport, amongst many other things. The PRISM thing, the attempt on, and I'm not going to say Obama did it, but because I don't want to sound like I'm anti-Obama, but the habeas corpus being the attempt for that to be revoked, which is, your right to be charged for a crime is being revoked.
And I think, but it's right to criticize Obama. He was, has been said many times, he's not your boyfriend. He was a terrible president. He's compared to what we got now, completely different.
I saw a great meme yesterday. The meme was like, "Oh, you love Obama so much? Name the 7 countries he bombed."
Right. Exactly, the elimination of habeas corpus, and there's a litany of things in his legacy that are shameful. But the same is true of virtually any politician.
No, of course.
So I'm distrustful of any politician. Period. Anyone who would want that.
Thank you for saying that, because there was coming from the election cycle that happened here was immediately followed by the Brexit thing and the election cycle that happened in England. And one thing that I always thought was a strong characteristic of British people is that it didn't matter who was running for Parliament, everyone was always very, very distrustful of politicians. Even if they were your guy, they were never your guy. And that kind of team, like soccer team kind of mentality that drove everyone here to hysteria, I'm shocked that it naturally found a home back in England, which has historically always been very suspicious of politicians for hundreds of years.
Rightly so.
Yeah, it's a strange thing, but everyone is now taking their sides, and it's scary.
It's absolutely scary. I mean, the Brexit thing. I mean, there's so many parallels between here and there. The funny part being, I had to be the one who broke the Brexit vote to everybody in conflict and collapsed while we were on the road. I just saw that on my phone. I was like, guess what, boys? you're leaving. And they
Right.
were like, no, they couldn't believe it. But
Well, the funny thing is that you have to even look at that with a skeptical eye, in the sense that, like Brexit, we're talking about the European Union. We are talking about big controlling government, and as far as an anarchic point of view, big controlling government is not really. I don't know. Is when does anarchism become communism? It goes from no government to absolute government in a very in a gnat's nutsack hair. So,
yeah, no, it can go bad on you pretty quick. But which is why it requires study and vigilance and due consideration. But in the case of Brexit, I think my issue is more with the population that was ready to accept the narrative of getting England back. And what they were talking about is a white England.
It was horrible. You can look at various economic reasons why Brexit might have been a good thing. You can look at many reasons why being a homogenous European state might be a good thing. But the way it was sold to people was horrible. They preyed on the worst parts of a country that thinks it's very dignified, and it's so much so that I can't remember the party, the UKIP, UKIP. They're just they were so divisive, and so they played on the racial card so much that when they actually achieved Brexit, they disbanded because they didn't have anything else but identity politics.
Jehovah's Witness into your house. They don't have anything to say because no one's ever let them in before. Totally. I never got this far. But in that respect, the same bill of goods that England was sold about Brexit is a direct mirror of the Trump voter here. The narrative that they were sold and ultimately bought. And the whole thing is, I don't doubt that there's a great deal of buyer's remorse going on out there currently, but there's so much, wringing of hands and sharpening of weapons over on the left that they can't capitulate because there's everyone waiting to say "I told you so" and jump down their throat.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there was a lot of talk about the Rust Belt, and a lot of talk about the Rust Belt that voted Democratic, and switched to what was essentially this is the problem. It's not. I guess it kind of is a problem. We had two populist contenders for the crown between Bernie and Donald Trump, and we're at a time in history where the people are feeling so dislocated from their own lives that's when populists take hold. On a side note, populists taking hold historically never worked out that well, but that was what we were looking at. It was Bernie versus Trump, and then when Bernie essentially had it, I'm not gonna say stolen away from him because it wasn't sure that he would have took it, but if anyone was going to defeat Trump, it probably would have been him. When the establishment stepped in and when people wanted a populist, the last thing they wanted was an establishment candidate. And that's exactly what we got. And that's how bad populists come in. There's, name a good populist in history. I mean, I don't think they exist.
Name a good politician in history. I mean, it's just...
Oh, yeah, well, this is true, yeah. Yeah. You know what? The best politicians have often been the most boring politicians. John Major in England. John Major, so unbelievably boring. I'm not even sure if he was a conservative or a late. I think he was conservative. Yeah, he was conservative. But he was ushered in, and it was like watching paint dry for 4 years. And he was ushered out again.
It was the Ford administration here, post-Nixon, before Carter. You had Gerald Ford, who was like, no one even has an opinion about because I don't think anyone ever got through 5 minutes of anything he said
yeah, totally.
during his tenure because it was just like it was was horrible.
Yeah.
It was insufferable. It was like an insurance seminar. No one was going to pay any attention at all. But yeah, same thing.
Yeah, and it's weird. I mean, where do we go from here? I mean, I had this theory that maybe we should have a Republican and a Democratic president, and anytime something came on the table, they just fucking flipped a coin. I mean, at this point, it doesn't fucking matter. So.
How could it be any worse? Really.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. We're going to get one extreme or the other, so maybe we have a mixture of extremes? I don't know. It's such a sad thing.
What it really boils down to is there's just divides along the line of urban and rural, really.
Really?
I mean, that's really what we're looking at in this country. There's people that live in, big cities and which generally tend to swing liberal, and people that are out in the sticks that tend to swing conservative. And
there's also
a hard gap to bridge.
There's also a big divide of just personalities. You will always have a conservative personality out there. There's people who like order, who like family values. There's religious people, and then there's people who are liberal who are kind of tear down the walls, meet new people, get out there. I'm not talking even political. I'm just talking in the way that attitudes are, and these people will always be butt heads, and that's all. And you're always going to get one type voting for one person. You're always going to get another type voting for another person. What really surprised me during the election was on the Democratic side, there was an odd theory that kind of surprised me, where Hillary Clinton would be saying that she had the Hispanic vote and the black vote because they're minorities against Republicans. But that itself was quite racist. That is the racist element of the left, in the fact that, I'm married to a Latina Mexican woman, and her family for the most part are quite left leaning, but they're also Latino families, which you're part of a Latino family yourself. Family values is a big part of Latino culture. Religion is a big part of Latino culture. Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and making something for yourself is a big part of that culture. And to say that necessarily they want to lean socialist all the way is a bit presumptuous. Okay. If someone had built a plumbing company themselves and bought a house for their family so they could take their family to church and all that sounds to me a little bit conservative. That's a bit of a conservative outlook on life. So it's a bit presumptuous for someone to just categorize an entire demographic of millions of people to one vote. And I think there was a big backlash. And I think maybe... Sorry, my baby is crying in the background. I think a lot of the people from more diverse ethnic groups being on the conservative side in the battle for Berkeley may be people who said, hang on a minute, thank you for speaking for me, which is the cardinal sin in the left, It's like the snake that eats itself, it's crazy. It's nuts.
It's a dangerous thing. And we talk about this a lot, that there's a danger in the left. Is the left is very quick to speak for people and to make statements, particularly when we get into the identity politics thing and we start talking about race. We berate the conservatives for this othering and declaring them this, those minorities and this and that. But I see the left doing the same exact thing, in as much as they're speaking for a group of people that they do not know.
Yes.
And so you're trying to liberate people that you do not have any direct relationship or dialogue with. Mm-hmm. So it, to me, is very, it's ill-conceived, ill-informed, and not incredibly productive, particularly in the way that it's addressed. So I think that's where the left also loses a lot of it, particularly, Clinton clearly, shit the bed completely. And with the left leaning fully into identity politics and just getting rid of economics, as a main platform. That's
it
where
was a very dangerous thing, very dangerous, and that's one of the things that I respected about Bernie, is that for a progressive candidate, he stuck to he sounded boring because he stuck to a single message, which was take big money out of politics. He probably knew the second he stuck his toe into the quagmire of identity politics, the whole thing would go out the fucking window.
Yep.
And since he didn't get the nomination, the whole thing did go out the fucking window. I remember seeing him being interviewed on the Young Turks and various other places, and people would be trying to pull those questions out of him, and he would always go back to his talking point: money in politics. And it's a crazy reality that I respect the guy even more just because he knew that was the case. He knew he was playing with fire.
But he wouldn't get swayed. That was the one thing the reason that I thought that Bernie had such a great shot until we, found out that the DNC, definitely fucked with him.
Oh,
Schultz admitted it plainly.
And they went in dry as well. It was rough.
But that said, the shot that he had, I thought, was expressly because he spoke in bumper stickers. It was, in this ridiculously short attention span. Trump had Make America Great Again. And this was, Bernie was get the money out of politics. Mm-hmm. Free care for everyone.
Billionaires can't buy Bernie. That's the one I still see, yeah.
And it was simple. It was easy. You could remember his entire platform, mm-hmm. in 3 sentences. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what people are drawn to now.
It's just a shame that he had a penis, really. That sounds crass, but that was what was thrown at him over and over and over.
That was definitely a part of it, for sure.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And then the identity politics, I know that the Black Lives Matter thing didn't help him.
Well, there was a bit of that. I remember. Was it in Seattle? I don't remember. When they actually overtook his platform, and he was courteous and he let them do their thing.
He yielded.
Yeah, but he shouldn't have necessarily done that. But at the same time, when they did get the microphone, they didn't yield an awful lot of helpful information. So that's a strange thing. I'm from Bristol in England, in the UK. Bristol has an extremely checkered past, being possibly the central city of the slave trade. And although no slaves slavery didn't exist in England, we didn't actually have slavery in England. It was the main port for the Triangle. Right. And Bristol has had a very guilty conscience since. It's one of the uglier cities in England because it constantly demolishes buildings and rebuilds buildings. It doesn't want to cling to its heritage like a city like Bath, which is very close. Still has Roman statues in the centre from 2,000 years ago. Bristol doesn't have that. But what Bristol does have are roads called White Ladies Road. There's Black Boy Hill. There's Cabot Tower, a huge tower with John Cabot on top. And the interesting thing about that is that over the years, people have tried to change the names of streets, remove those things because of the negative connotations of the past. And we're talking very direct negative connotations. There's nothing vague about it. Right. But the people who opposed the removal of these names and places and statues were actually the Caribbean and Jamaican and essentially black minority communities. They built a beautiful bridge across the harbour there and said this is in memory of the slaves, and the local black community went, no, you don't get off that easy. And it's strange. They want the local ethnic community wants these things to stay in place because they don't want a whitewashing
Right.
of history. And often a lot of the people who are pushing and advocating for these things to change are quite liberal white people, of which in Bristol there are many. I'm seeing the opposite here, maybe. I don't know. It's interesting. I haven't done a lot of research into it, but the removal of statues and stuff, I come from a point of view, the reason Auschwitz still stands, sorry to invoke Godwin's law of it always comes back to Nazis, but but the reason Auschwitz still stands is that those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. And I'm not saying necessarily in the centre of cities you should be celebrating these things, but there is a certain whitewashing of history. You have to look at who is advocating for what.
Precisely. That's the central point for me.
Yeah.
Is who's doing the ask?
Mm-hmm.
Where's it coming from? And if it's a bunch of white liberal nonsense, that's pushing for this out of no other thing than this sort of moral purity issue, I'm less inclined to give that an ear than I am if the African American community, in the South, is making the very valid point that this is just a constant monument to this horrible part of history that they may not want to be confronted with on a daily basis.
Absolutely,
it's a very solid argument for relocating those things to a museum. Or a
and
place
not even all of them. Like we can take the ones that put it in context best and put it in a situation of education and learning. We don't have to keep everything. There's not many statues of Hitler left in Germany, I'm sure, but I don't think they need reminding anytime soon.
Remember him.
Yeah. But Auschwitz. That's an interesting question. Auschwitz obviously is in Poland. I'm wondering if... Actually, I already know the answer to that question. There are still standing death camps in Germany. So there are no statues of Hitler, but outside of Erfurt, a very ominous tower stands. So, yeah, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. And
100%. And I think that applies in a much broader sense as well, because there's been a lot of discussion. I've certainly mucked in a bit with this one, but if anyone does a real study of Weimar-era Germany, before the Nazis came to power, there's a very eerie parallel at this moment.
Oh, and Italy as well, before Mussolini, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep. But it was the violence from the left that was used as a pretext for this massive wave of getting the moderates to swing over to the right and put these guys in power.
Yes.
Which is what led to everything that followed.
Oh, yes.
And it's an easy fucking trick. And that is where that statement, I think, applies most practically just in this moment.
Yeah.
Where if you forget the past, if you are not paying attention to the actual steps, the actual way that it took, the course that this followed to arrive at that final fucked up conclusion, we're on track to repeat it. Absolutely. Wow. I mean, how much longer of this Antifa and Nazis back and forth kind of thing do you think we can get? How many people actually have to get killed before freedom of assembly goes out the window?
Well, exactly. I mean, what happens next? So we've had one person hit by a car. Let's stay lefty here, so we don't get pigeonholed in this conversation. So next time round, some Second Amendment nut, NRA nut, walks in with a AR-16 and sees a bunch of Antifa. Antifa have essentially dehumanized themselves by wearing masks. So it's very easy for this Second Amendment nut to just look at them as a mass of enemy as opposed to people, because they have essentially dehumanized themselves by covering themselves up. So an AR-16 gets fired into a crowd. 20 people die. So, not wanting to let the left off the hook. The left, Antifa, there is a definite... I don't understand anarcho-communism. I don't... it's like an oxymoron that I can't get into, but we'll leave that one alone. But say someone puts a pipe bomb in a trash can and it takes off a young lady's arm. I say lady because we're talking about identity politics. So is the young lady losing an arm worse than 16 people being killed by an assault rifle? Who knows? But it's tit for tat at that point. And then all of a sudden, someone doesn't drive a car, someone drives a truck, like what happens in Paris and Nice and stuff. Then all of a sudden, the police aren't standing on the sidelines. We've seen quite a militarization of the police force over the last 10, 15 years.
Most major police departments have wraps now. They look like paramilitary, and it's not your beat cop walking the neighborhood. Top of the morning to you, ma'am. Yeah. It's an entirely different thing now. This looks like like any front. Mm-hmm. And again, the state knows how to employ violence better than anybody. Everyone else is amateur compared to them.
The government is monopoly on violence. That's what government is. Government is monopoly on violence.
And they love that in that arena because they know how to manipulate it better than anybody. So that is the end result of all this. And I don't think that anyone's thinking it through. I think that it's I think the tactics and strategies that are being employed currently by the left is remarkably myopic and short-sighted, and really about it's subjective. It's making yourself feel good. It's look, we did this, blah blah blah, and without thinking it through, without following that line, through, and what comes next, what happens afterward.
It's crazy. I mean, Richard Spencer is a white ethno-nationalist. Which is, to me, another term for idiot. It's like, as a white male, I do not identify with most white males in any way, shape, or form. We don't, I don't see us as a bunch of white nationalists. I see us as a bunch of dorks with like Ian Curtis pants pulled up too high. It's like.
I've seen you naked. It was one of the most traumatizing experiences of my life. I don't have any love of the white thing per se. One of the pastiest things I've ever seen in all my days on this planet.
Okay, we're gonna have to. We'll have to fill everyone in on this. Let's make this a little bit more lighthearted. So I have a short memory. What exactly happened?
Oh well, that story. That would have been the Faith and the Muse tour of 2010, I want to say. Mm-hmm. We played in Budapest, and we were all sleeping in sort of a local hostel, as I remember. And me and Monica and Patty were in one room. You and Marcia were in another, and I believe we had adjoining rooms, as I recall. And at one point, you came in to our room and said, unless you want to get an eyeful of man meat, I recommend that you keep this door closed for the next couple of minutes or whatever it was. And so I thought it would be great fun to cover my eyes and throw the door open and then shut the door again very quickly, which I, of course, did. Thinking the joke was over, you chose to enter the room buck naked and say, I told you that you would get an eyeful. There's just a lot of screaming, a lot of crying. I screamed into my pillow for 5 hours.
I actually, my memory of it is, I'm not sure if it was you or Monica, just went, oh no. But it had this like depressing down tone to it, like, oh no.
I think that was me.
You will never unsee.
Hey, we're screaming, as I recall it. But.
Yeah. I was hoping, actually, my plan was that I'm so pasty and white that the natural brilliance of the reflection of light would, I would be some like messiah figure walking through the door, just.
The room.
That's how I like to remember it, of course.
But the room lit up in more ways than one, shall we say.
Crikey. So okay, so that was an intense, good tour of a lot of people involved,
Yes,
and
indeed.
I'm constantly told time and time again that people turned up to the shows and were blown away. I have to respect your vision for delivering something. You know, I played in punk bands. I've done this. I've done that. I've never been one to be shy of jumping around stage, but you had a vision for that tour, and I think that vision really touched a lot of people. Um, where did you pull that from? We had. I mean, you had me. I learned to play viola. I'd never played a mandolin before. I certainly never played taiko drums before, but we had got together and we all took taiko drum lessons together, and it was it was amazing. You opened my eyes to the possibility of what a stage show can be, as opposed to a gig down the Dog and Duck. So
One of my favorite memories of that entire thing was watching you learn taiko. Of everyone, you were clearly enjoying it the most.
in for a penny, in for a pound. That's what I say.
As soon as you put the bachi in your hand, you were just like, you're like a kid on purpose. It was like
Yeah, that's the problem. I actually was the worst at it because I don't think you're supposed to smile that much while playing taiko drum.
Well, over time, I think you got that under control. But in the beginning, it was just you were clearly having the best time.
Me hit thing with stick. Okay.
Yep. But it was obviously great fun.
Yeah.
But no, it was one of these things where with Faith and Muse, it was frustrating over the years to be so limited. Every time we went out, we were having to cut corners or do something, and this was the one time where we said, let's do this the way we always wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And so the taiko thing, was going to be a prominent feature of the album, and the percussion things I've always felt really come across powerfully live. So I wanted to make sure that was there.
Mm-hmm.
Monica had brought up the Buto concept. She encountered it and kind of said, "Hey, this is kind of cool." And then I fell in love with it immediately and ran with it, and then started searching for people that did it. That's what led us to Serpentine, and that's where Iridia and Lucretia came in, and I thought that worked really well live. And then, obviously working with you guys, that was a no-brainer. You and Marcita are two of the best people I ever worked with. And
thanks.
Awesome.
I'll tell Marcia that you consider us no-brainers. I'll pass that message on.
But and then of course Paul, who was just amazing, and Julia, who was a star, and Jeff, bless him, who worked harder than anybody.
I don't know if Paul Mercer will ever see this, but I remember my caution. Originally, you had told me that Paul Mercer was the violin player was going to be involved, and I was like, violin player. And you explained to me how good he was, and that he has certain standards, And my memory fades, but there was something in the communication where I was immediately on my heels about it. Like, I don't know if I'm going to be cool with touring with this guy. He sounds like he's going to be a pain in the ass. Like, I don't want a mega diva on this tour. And within 2.3.7 seconds, Paul Mercer is one of the greatest and most talented human beings I've ever met.
Yep. And hysterical. It's that combination.
Sharing a stage with him was just an honor right up to the last show of the tour, but unfortunately he had eaten something quite suspicious.
And he was holding his butt cheeks together through the show as tightly as whenever.
That was the one show that I regret ever playing with.
The best part is I was actually trying to, on the last song in the set, that was actually Summer Darkness in Utrecht, Netherlands that night.
Mm-hmm.
And, infamous evening. But that one, we were live and during Sovereign, I was kind of messing with Paul a little bit on the middle eight, and he didn't know any of it because he had his eyes closed because he was clenching so tightly trying to inside. He didn't know it until he saw the video later.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's amazing. And Paul, if you are watching this, the other Amsterdam incident, we'll save that for another day. Maybe I'll get Paul. Maybe I'll get Paul on here. We'll recount that. Yeah,
Yes. We'll keep it on the inside for now, much as you should have.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing about going on tour. I always felt bad for tour bus drivers when you go to Europe, because when you go on a 3, 4, 5+ week tour as a group of people and you're flying out from the States and you're meeting a tour bus driver, it's unfortunate for the tour bus driver that most of the in-jokes of the tour have already been cemented before you even meet them. So the poor tour bus drivers, I think the hardest part of it is just trying to figure out what the fuck everyone is talking about. The in-jokes are in and they're not in on the in-jokes. Just the flight over. I think the most important part of any tour is probably the first 4 hours. It's like you get to the airport, you have a beer, everyone agrees on something really stupid, and then they take it to the absolute max within 2 months. It's insane living, and I love it dearly.
If you're clever, you can make a whole career out of it.
But I'm not clever. Instead of that, me and Maisie decided to have a son, and stay indoors for the last 2 years. So,
and the cleverness down. That said, you've still managed to get out and do things. I think you just got back from San La Muerte not long ago.
I did, yeah. That was interesting and sweaty weekend. We made it to Texas before the hurricane hit, which was relatively good timing, and played with Omega Tribe, which is an absolute favorite of mine. I'm wearing their shirt. There you go, right now. But, yeah, just... There you go, bless them. Bless their cotton socks. Yep. But Omega Tribe, a nicer bunch of blokes I could never hope to meet. It was a lovely thing. And the person who puts San La Muerte on is Christ vs. Warhol's drummer.
Robert.
That was cool. So it was a DIY fest, with all the pitfalls that DIY fests have.
Sure.
There's not a huge amount of cash flowing through these things, so everyone has to be there on an ideological basis, really. But it was great. A local band to you now. The guitarist from Cemetery, Des, lent me his guitar. Which is good. Flights are getting so insane now that we couldn't bring instruments, so we borrowed 2 instruments. Des lent me his SG, which I've always been a Telecaster guy, but now I own an SG now. Now I'm a SG guy, which is crazy.
That's weird.
Yeah, it's a strange thing. I love my SG now, but
we're playing guitar for the business sometime soon.
Yeah, totally. Oddly enough, the guitar player from KSUK was offered to play in the business at one point. He did. He turned it down. Playing in the business, I think, is hard work. There's always a certain clientele that we discussed earlier that will turn that to a business show. But
in all fairness, Kevin from Conflict played in SG as well.
So let's talk about Conflict. I was going to talk about Des, but Des, I love you. Thank you for lending me your guitar. But you've been playing in Conflict on and off over the last 8 years or so. So how did you get mixed in with that lot?
More than a decade now, actually. But it's it's been on and off. I mean, it's ever revolving lineup, and it's always been the case. And Colin's a madman. I love him to death. But he's it's like herding cats with that band. Always has been.
Yeah. I feel like me and Colin would get on like a house on fire.
That's a good question.
I had the opportunity via you as a conduit, obviously, to play bass in Conflict. Unfortunately, our son was only a few months old at that point, and the insanity of our life was a lot more than we had gambled on. So I regret that. That would have been, it would have been great to go on the road with you again. But I kind of want, I like me some conflict.
The thing about that tour that I think you would have loved most of all is beyond conflict itself. Is we were on tour with Grand Collapse, which is Stig's son Calvin's band, Icons of Filth, and their Grand Collapse are fucking amazing. And they sound more like American hardcore than they do anything British. But but one of the best drummers ever, Glenn, who's just fucking amazing. Best right foot I've seen, probably bar none. And but just amazing. Bunch of Welsh nutters, and they're hysterical. They're about your age, so they're. And just watching them in various states of decay throughout the whole tour, just drinking too late, staying up. And
I put on one of the last Icons of Filth shows back in Bristol at the Junction, little pub, and I was involved with that. And
through Pete,
yeah, absolutely. And Pete Rose, the guitar player, not the original guitar player, but the guy who's playing. He did all my piercings. He did my, when I was a little lad, way before I was old enough to get this, which he was angry about when he found out many years later. He did this for me, but yeah, I put on one of Icons of Filth's last shows, and actually when the singer sadly passed away, those guys were they went into a bit of a funk. I was playing in KSUK at the time, and I was hanging out with Pete a lot because he lived down the road from me, and he was constantly talking that he needed to get out of that rut because the story of how he passed was quite sad. But actually, kind of, I don't know. Sad is weird. They were playing in London. They played a show in London, and they played apparently a blazing show, and the gig ended, but it was like before the encore, and they walked off stage, and he went outside for a bit of fresh air, and had a brain aneurysm, and Pete and that walked out and found him stone cold dead on the floor. And you'd like to think that's a sad way to go, but to me that sounds like what they call the king's death. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to sound insensitive, but a brain aneurysm is an instant thing, and walking off a packed gig in front of a bunch of people cheering from you, and then just having a light switch go.
A lot of worse ways to go.
There's a lot worse ways to go. But it's rough. It's rough. But Pete and Ed, the original, I think he was originally the drummer, but he was playing bass at the time. Yep. And Ed's like a Welsh Viking. He's a lovely guy, but you have to get to know him. He's a scary fella, but he's a lovely guy. He's
great.
We got together and we rehearsed a couple of times before I moved to the States. Just to, I was playing bass, Pete was playing guitar, Ed was back on drums, and we were writing a bunch of stuff. But the first rehearsal we did, Pete had his Marshall head in a case, and he put it on the cab, and he pulled it out, and as he pulled the lid off the case, the set list from the last Icons of Filth show just kind of fell out and kind of gently fluttered down to the floor. And we all just stared at it, and it was that was one of the heaviest moments I remember. I've seen two very big tattooed dudes. I'm not going to say tear up, but just like.
I'm sure the air went out of the room.
Yeah. It was heavy. It was just, but it was in a respectful way. It was like that was a moment. And we kind of stopped and went outside. We were like, okay, let's give that a moment. Yeah. Just a little thing like that. It was still a very raw nerve. So
yeah, I'm sure that put them right back in it for a minute.
Yeah.
Not because there's a memento from the moment.
Yeah.
It's gotta be
but about getting back to conflict, I mean, there's been similar losses in the last couple of years from conflict as well, right?
Well, I mean, Paco,
Yeah,
died a few years back now, and that was a thing.
yeah,
And I mean, I can't say anyone was terribly surprised in that. His health was clearly, declining, but it was horrible nonetheless.
Yeah.
And, I'd only met Paco, a couple of times, but it was just a sweet guy and crucial member of Conflict. The band would never have been the way it was without him. I mean, the guy was a musical absolute genius and one of the best drummers in punk rock, if not the best.
I remember seeing you play down on the Sunset Strip. Where was it? The Key Club?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah. That was a bit of an infamous show because the security got involved a little bit. I remember some people getting tossed down the stairs a little bit. But where are you going?
Just moving because I'm about to run out of juice.
Oh, okay. So. Okay. All right. Well, we're an hour and 34 minutes into this, so maybe a part 2 is in order at some point. But you good?
Yeah, all good.
Oh, excellent. There you go. Okay. But no, amazing drummer. Like, I mean, I was actually slightly daunted by. Actually, I'll preface the actual truth. You guys were like, do you think Marzi might want to play bass in Conflict? And she's an infinitely better bass player than me. And that's easy to say because she's an infinitely better bass player than almost everyone.
Yeah. Say that.
Yeah, but conflict songs it's a full contact sport.
100%.
The ungovernable force, just that bass intro. Your pick hand's got to be going for it.
Yep.
So, I was a little bit nervous, just on that note. But
it was funny because when I was asking you about playing bass, I had thought about it for a minute, about that long.
Right.
So I was like, obviously started as a bass player, and was a bass player in all my first bands, up until Faith and Muse, really.
Yeah.
And